I'm here at the Center for Civil and Human Rights, and 3 years ago, no more than 100 yards that way, people were thronged in the street, calling for justice in the wake of the death of George Floyd. We had an awakening of racial consciousness, both in Atlanta and in America. And so the question I'm asking today is whether or not that was a moment or a movement. Here we are 3 years later, and one has to ask whether or not the events of 2020 have led to sustained change and improvement in the lives of Black Atlantans and Black Americans. So we're here with three very different perspectives on what happened. We're looking at it both from the political perspective, from an economic perspective, and from a spiritual perspective. These are things we need to talk about on the next Atlanta. I'm George Chidi. This is the Center for Civil and Human Rights, and this is the next Atlanta. I'm here with Gerald Griggs, who is the president of the Georgia Conference of the NAACP, and I am just delighted. Like, you're a good friend, and I'm glad you're here.
Yeah, well, George, thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here in the Center for Civil and Human Rights, talking about issues that affect Georgia and that affect specifically Atlanta.
Good stuff. So here's the thing. Here we are. It's the start of a new year. And I was going through the number of police-involved fatal shootings in Metro Atlanta. City of Atlanta usually has 2 in a year. That's their average for like 10 years before 2019. They had 7 last year. Cobb County had 6. You add it all up, you're in the low 20s for Metro Atlanta, and that's easily double, maybe triple what is normal. 3 years ago, people were in the street over stuff like this, and right now, I'm not sure it's even a headline. Like, what do we do? Like, how do we get to this?
Well, first, we have to recognize that any loss of life is too many. And then secondly, we have to realize we're being desensitized by these continued injustices that are happening. And I call them injustices because at no point should the system be allowed to take a civilian's life and there be no accountability. So what's happening in Metro Atlanta, what's happening around the country, is a microcosm of the problems in American policing. We have to address the systemic issues. It's not one isolated case here. It's not one bad actor here. It's a system that has to be recalculated to deal with these things. And I think policymakers don't want to really have that conversation. You know, after 2020, there were a lot of promises that were made, but the passage of the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act did not happen to reform the system. And so now the public is becoming calcified in responding to these things, which is why you don't see the big protests that you saw in 2020. But trust and believe, just because people aren't marching in the streets, they are still angry and they want to make sure that change and accountability happens.
It's interesting. The last time you and I were in the same place at the same time, it was at a press conference about 2 weeks ago. Jimmy Atchison was a young man who was killed by a police officer in Atlanta in 2017?
2019. January 22nd, 2019, he was killed by a member of the federal task force that was an Atlanta police officer.
I mean, years and years and years, his father's been protesting. Often alone, I might add, standing on a street corner with a sign. And it's been something to watch. At that press conference, you talked about a patterns and practices investigation.
Yes. And so we at the Georgia State Conference, along with our branch partner, the Atlanta NAACP, has called for a patterns and practice investigation into the Atlanta Police Department because we believe that there is a systematic injustice that continues to happen, primarily to African Americans, but to the greater community because of these police-involved shootings. And we can run off a list of names in Atlanta, from Rayshard Brooks to Alexia Christian to Oscar Kane to Kane Rogers to Jimmy Atchison, that have gone unaddressed. And so we believe that there is a pattern and practice of systemic injustice that happens in the Atlanta Police Department that needs to be addressed. Now, we're not going after the current police chief. We're going after the system of inequities that have been happening for years. And so I think it underscores the fact that we have a list of names that we can rattle off, and we are just now in the process of getting towards some semblance of accountability with Jimmy Atchison, with Kane Rogers. We still don't know what's happening with Oscar Kane's case. Of course, we saw the dismissal of Rayshard Brooks' case, and these were some of the seminal names in Atlanta. The countless others that we don't know is a problem. And so we've called upon the federal government, to Department of Justice, to open an investigation similar to the George Floyd and Breonna Taylor investigations, and of course the Ahmaud Arbery, because we believe that there's a pattern of behavior that needs to be addressed.
So here's this thing. Like, it's more than just the police shootings and that going more or less unremarked upon, like, in the public. It's like, I'm sort of looking at how there were big promises about criminal justice reform, like top to bottom, from closing the city's jail to reforming the courts to looking at other elements of how policing works to like the general state of inequality in the city. And here we are, like about 3 years later, and not a lot has changed. What happened to the political will there?
Well, I think politicians respond to news cycles. And they have to understand that justice is not about a news cycle. And so when the news cycle shifted during the pandemic to the rise in violence, the rise in citizen-on-citizen violence, the political will shifted as well. But we have to remind people that we're on a continuum of justice, and I don't care what's on the TV screens. What we're seeing in our communities over and over and over again is the lack of justice and accountability with regard to police-involved matters, to regard to systematic injustices that continue to happen. And what our politicians need to understand is we can walk and chew gum at the same time. Courthouses around this state are open every single day to address the rise in violence. The Supreme Court Justice Namias gave an opening remark last year about the backlog in the criminal justice system caused by the pandemic. That is what caused the rise in crime, because there was no accountability in the court system because we were closed. Now the courts are reopening. We are addressing the citizen-on-citizen violence, the murders, the assaults, the rapes, as we always do. But no one's addressing the police on citizen violence, which is equally unjust. It's not about being anti-law enforcement. It's about being pro-justice and justice applying equally to everyone.
So what priorities would you, like if you were president and governor and all the rest of this, like if you were the person in position of authority that could start to make changes, what would you be addressing?
First and foremost, we'd be addressing voting rights. We'd be passing the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. The second, we passed the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, which would codify protections for citizens to address these systemic issues, ending qualified immunity, making sure that police officers are held to the same standard as citizens when we're involved in a police-involved shooting. Those are the top priorities that if I was the CEO of this city or if I was a governor of this state, because the first thing you have to do is reinstall the public trust. And the only way public trust is reinstalled is when there's confidence that justice will be fair and equal. We can address the rise in crime by addressing the underlying issues of poverty, of lack of education, of lack of quality access to housing and jobs. Those are the root causes of what we are seeing. But putting a Band-Aid on a severed arm is not going to work. You have to address the issues that cause the arm to have to be severed and the gangrene that's setting in.
So there has been an increase in violence. Like, I mean, everybody, you can see the numbers. Do you think that that has eroded the political will? Like, do you think politicians think that somebody's going to run a tough on crime campaign against them and knock them out in a way that is keeping them from doing the things that you're talking about?
Well, I think politicians need to actually listen to the people, not the press. If you go and talk to the people, you would understand that there are household items that they want to deal with. They want to deal with educating their children. They want to feel safe. They want to make sure they have a good job and quality of food to eat. And what we have to do is to listen to the people. In order to reduce crime, you have to introduce more opportunities, and that's not happening. You cannot arrest your way out of this issue.
Gerald Griggs, I'm just delighted that you've been here to talk to us. I'm grateful. Thank you.
Thank you for having me, George. It's always a pleasure.